There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself. It does not knock on the door or make a sound in the night. It simply settles, quietly, steadily, like dust on a windowsill that nobody bothers to wipe clean. Margaret Calloway knew this loneliness better than she knew the sound of her own name. She had lived inside it for so long that she had stopped noticing it. And that perhaps was the saddest part of all. She was 53 years old, and by every measure the world used to judge a woman. She had been quietly filed away, not with cruelty, not with intention, just with the casual, effortless indifference that society reserves for women who have crossed some invisible line that nobody ever tells them about until it is already far behind them. Her hair had silvered at the temples. The corners of her eyes carried the soft lines of a life that had laughed and grieved and kept going anyway. She dressed well, spoke thoughtfully, and laughed from somewhere deep and real. But in a room full of people, Margaret Calloway was always, somehow, the woman no one truly saw. She had been a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Columbus, Ohio for 11 years. She was dependable, precise, and unfailingly kind to the people who worked under her. Younger colleagues were promoted past her with congratulatory emails she helped draft. Clients praised her work in meetings she was not invited to attend. She had learned not to make a face when it happened. She had learned, in fact, to make no face at all. Her marriage had ended 6 years earlier. Not dramatically, not with screaming or betrayal, but with a quiet mutual recognition that two people had grown so far in opposite directions that love had simply run out of room to exist between them. Her ex-husband, Daniel, had remarried within 2 years. His new wife was 38. Margaret had seen the wedding, photos on a mutual friend's social media page, and had closed her phone and washed the dishes, and gone to bed and stared at the ceiling for a long, long time. She had 2 friends she trusted completely, Diane from work, and her college roommate Sandra, who lived in Portland and called every Sunday. Outside of that small circle, Margaret existed in a world that had, without malice or announcement, decided she was no longer the main character of any story worth watching. She told herself it was fine. She had her routines, her morning coffee on the back porch, her Thursday evening yoga class, the historical fiction novels she kept stacked on her nightstand, the small garden in the backyard where she grew tomatoes and herbs. She cooked with, but often ate alone. She told herself that contentment was its own form of happiness. She told herself this often enough that she almost believed it. James Whitfield had believed in something once. He had believed in it with the specific, stubborn faith of a man who has staked everything on a dream and willed it into reality through sheer refusal to quit. His restaurant, Ember, had been his life's work. 7 years of 60-hour weeks, of learning the difference between a business and a passion, of building something from absolutely nothing in a city that had more restaurants per block than parking spaces. Ember was not a flashy place. It was warm and honest. Exposed brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, a chalkboard menu that changed with the season, and food that James cooked with the kind of care that made people feel, without understanding why, that someone had thought about them before they even arrived. For 4 years it had worked. The reviews were not from big publications, but they were real, written by people who came back again and again and brought their parents and their anniversaries and their heartbreaks and asked to be seated at the same corner table where once something had felt right. Then the building's ownership changed hands. The new landlord tripled the rent in 14 months. James held on, renegotiated, borrowed, restructured. He let go of 2 kitchen staff and covered their shifts himself. He shortened the hours. He rewrote the menu around cheaper ingredients without letting it show. He did everything a person can do when the math is slowly becoming impossible, and pride will not let you stop until the last possible moment. The last possible moment came on a Tuesday in October. He stood in the empty dining room after closing. Lights off except for the kitchen. The chairs still on the tables from where his last remaining employee had stacked them. He was 47 years old. His savings were gone. His credit was gone. His marriage, which had been fraying long before Ember's troubles began, had ended formally that spring. His daughter, Lily, was 17 and lived with her mother in Cincinnati. She called on Wednesdays, and he always answered no matter what was happening. And he always said he was fine. And she always sounded like she was deciding whether or not to believe him. He locked the restaurant door for the final time at 11:15 that night and sat in his car for 40 minutes without starting the engine. Then he drove to the only place open at that hour near his apartment. A 24-hour grocery store. Because he had not eaten since morning and there was nothing in his refrigerator, and even grief, it turns out, cannot fully silence the body's simplest needs. Margaret was in the soup aisle when she heard someone say something quietly desperate under their breath. Not words exactly, more like the sound a person makes when they are holding themselves together through sheer mechanical effort and one small thing has just exceeded their capacity. She turned and saw a man standing in front of the canned goods with a basket in his hand, staring at a shelf with the expression of someone who has just realized they cannot remember what they came here for. She almost looked away. She was practiced at that, at the polite invisibility of urban life, at the agreement strangers make to not truly see each other in public spaces. But something in the particular quality of his stillness stopped her. He looked not just tired but emptied out, like a house after everything has been moved. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked up. He had dark eyes with exhaustion pooled behind them, and a few days of stubble and the kind of face that had probably been easy, with smiles once, and was now working hard to remember how. "Yeah," he said automatically. Then, because she was still looking at him with the uncomplicated attentiveness of someone who actually wanted to know. "No, not really." "Okay," she said simply. He laughed, a short surprise sound, like it had escaped before he could stop it. "That's it. Just okay? You don't have to explain anything to a stranger in a grocery store at midnight," she said. "But if you want to, I have nowhere urgent to be." His name was James. He did not tell her about the restaurant that night. That came later. He told her only that he'd had a bad day and was struggling to remember what normal felt like. She told him she understood that specific feeling more than he knew. They stood in the soup aisle for 20 minutes talking about nothing and everything. And by the time they parted ways at the checkout, something had shifted in the air between them. Carefully, tentatively, like the first day of a season changing, he asked if he could have her number. She paused, and in that pause was 6 years of being made to feel like too much and not enough simultaneously. Then she gave it to him. She did not expect him to call. He called the next afternoon. They met for coffee the following Saturday at a small place near her apartment. James was early. He was sitting with his hands wrapped around a mug when she walked in, and he stood up immediately when he saw her, which was such an unexpectedly old-fashioned gesture that it caught her off guard, and she smiled before she meant to. He told her about Ember over the next 2 hours. He told her about what it had been, what it had cost, and what had happened at the end. He was not looking for sympathy. His voice was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. The way people talk about wounds they are still too close to for full feeling. But his eyes were another story. His eyes said everything his voice was carefully managing not to. Margaret listened the way she had always listened, completely, without filling the silences unnecessarily, without rushing to reassure or redirect. She asked questions that showed she had actually heard what he said. She did not tell him it would be fine. She did not offer silver linings. She just let the truth of what he had been through exist in the space between them, without flinching away from it. "You're very easy to talk to," he said eventually. "I've been told I'm easy to overlook," she replied. She had not meant to say it. It came out small and unguarded, and she looked down at her coffee cup immediately after. He was quiet for a moment. "That's one of the stranger things I've heard," he said. "You're the first person who's made me feel like myself in months." She looked up. He was not performing sincerity. It was simply present in his expression, clear and uncomplicated. She did not know what to do with that, so she thanked him and changed the subject, and thought about what he had said all the way home and into the evening. And through a night of unusually light sleep, they began spending time together with the careful, unspoken agreement of two people who have both been burned and are not willing to pretend otherwise. Sunday walks along the Scioto, dinners at her apartment where she cooked, and he sat at the kitchen counter and talked, while she moved between the stove and the cutting board. Evenings where they watched old films and argued pleasantly about which decade had produced the best screenwriters. He started helping her with the garden. He knew things about herbs from years in restaurant kitchens, their growing seasons, their companion plants, the way basil bolts in heat and needs constant harvesting to stay full. He crouched in the dirt beside her on a Saturday afternoon, explaining the difference between pruning and pinching, and she watched him come alive in a small, specific way that she recognized as the return of someone to themselves. She helped him in turn without planning to. She had spent 11 years managing complex projects, budgets, timelines, vendors, people. She began asking him questions about Ember, about what had worked and what hadn't, about the numbers and the structure and the decisions, not with the intention of solving anything but out of genuine curiosity. And in the process of explaining it to her, James began to see his own story differently, not as a failure, as a first attempt. "You lost a restaurant," she said one evening. "You didn't lose what you know how to do." He looked at her across the dinner table. "Nobody's ever said it like that." "Nobody was paying attention," she said, and meant it lightly. But they both understood the weight it carried. 3 months in, Diane pulled Margaret aside at work and said, "You look different." Margaret told her about James. Diane listened with the focused attention of a good friend and then said, "Is he good to you?" "Genuinely good?" Margaret thought about the ways James saw her, remembered details, made space, asked questions, and listened to the full answers. "Yes," she said, in a way I'd honestly stopped expecting. It was not without difficulty. James carried guilt about his daughter, about the years the restaurant had consumed, about the feeling that he had failed at being the person the people he loved deserved. Margaret carried her own accumulated armor, the protective distance she had built from years of being underestimated, of making herself smaller to fit spaces that should have expanded for her. They had both learned to manage alone, and the willingness to need someone again did not come easily for either of them. But what they had was honest, stubbornly, uncomplicatedly honest, and honesty, it turns out, is an extraordinary foundation. In the spring, James found a small commercial kitchen space available for rent, not a full restaurant, but a catering operation, modest and manageable. He had rebuilt enough to try again, smaller this time, more sustainable. He asked Margaret to help him write the business plan. She said yes without hesitation, and they spent 3 weekends at her kitchen table with spreadsheets and coffee and long debates about pricing and margins. And somewhere in the middle of the second weekend, she realized she was happier than she had been in years. Not the performed contentment of her routines, but actual happiness, present, warm, and real. The night before, he submitted the application for the kitchen space. James sat across from her in the quiet of her living room and said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I walked into that grocery store," he said, "I was at the bottom of everything. And I mean everything. And then this woman in the soup aisle looked at me like I was worth being concerned about, like I was a person who mattered in that specific moment." He paused. "I know this is going to sound like too much." "Say it anyway," she said. "You didn't save me," he said. "I don't mean it like that. But you reminded me that I existed. You saw me when I had nothing worth seeing, and you kept seeing me. And I don't know if you understand what that does to a person who has spent months feeling completely invisible." The word moved through her like a current. Invisible. She had spent 6 years feeling exactly that and had never said it aloud to anyone, had barely admitted it to herself, had buried it under routines and competence and the quiet, dignified endurance of a woman who had learned not to ask for more than the world seemed willing to give. Her eyes filled. She did not try to stop them. "James," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I see you. I want you to know that. I see you completely." She did not have words for a long moment. She did not need them. She simply looked at this man, this broke, humbled, rebuilding man who had walked into her life with empty hands and somehow, in spite of everything, given her back something she had stopped believing she still deserved. She reached across and took his hand. "Nobody ever looked for me before," she whispered. "They always looked past me." "Then they were fools," he said simply. "Every single one of them." The world had spent years telling Margaret Calloway that her chapter was finished, that she was the background of other people's stories, a detail in someone else's frame. It had done this not with venom, but with something worse, with boredom, with disinterest, with the casual turning away of eyes that had decided she was not the point. It had been wrong. She was the point. She had always been the point. It simply took a man who had lost everything to be stripped of the shallow metrics by which most people measure worth, and to find, in that stripped-down, humbled, honest state, that what he needed was not youth, or novelty, or the uncomplicated shine of something new. What he needed was someone real, someone steady, someone who listened with her whole self and saw with clear eyes and had loved and hurt and kept going, and still, despite everything, remained gentle. He had lost a restaurant and found a home. Not a building, a person, the kind of home that travels with you. and she had spent years being overlooked by people who were too busy looking for something else to recognize what was right in front of them. It took one man with nothing left to lose to look at her. Truly look and see everything. If this story has touched you, if you have ever felt that the world looks at you but never truly sees you, then do not stop this video here. This story is not just Margaret's. It belongs to everyone who deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to finally be found. Like and subscribe to this channel, because every week, stories come here that touch the heart directly. And if someone you love has ever felt invisible, then make sure you share this video with them. Sometimes just one story is enough to remind you that you are enough. You always were.